There we go. So, dear audience, dear panelists, good day. It's such a pleasure to moderate this session, Supply Chain Management and its role on Sustainable Development. I advise you, if you have any questions, you can just put in the chat or make it in the end. So we are planning some time in the end for questions. First of all, I would like to introduce our panelists. So we have here Nikodemus Soliander from Hanken School of Economics in Finland. He's sine tuot postdoctoral research in supply chain management and social responsibility at Hanken. He holds a PhD in supply chain management and corporate geography. His main expertise is in the areas of corporate responsibility, business and human rights, transnational advocacy networks, and responsible management education. We also have here Suzanne Young from LaTrobe Business School. Suzanne is the acting associate provost in College of Arts, Social Science, and Commerce in Academic Partnerships and International, responsible for the college's external teaching and internship partnerships located domestically and internationally. Nico and Suzanne are practically founding members of CR3, part of the living history of the conference, so it's really good to have you all here. And our third panelist, Susana Pereira. It's an honor for me to have her with us. She's my PhD advisor. She's Associate Professor in Supply Chain Management, Director of Innovation Research Center at São Paulo Business School from Fundação Getúlio Vargas, and Program Director of the Global MBA Manchester FGV. Thank you everyone for being here today. When we defined the theme of the conference back in 2019 and choose to talk about the role of innovation and building a sustainable future, the context of the planet was really different, as we know. We didn't even imagine what we would go through, and we start to work on choice of the themes for the panels. And in the current context, it was impossible not to talk about supply chain and all these implications. The coronavirus pandemic highlight lots of issues that we have and the importance of dealing with supply chain as a whole, whether in a local or global context. It was frequent to read the news and see the absence of products in supermarket shelves, for example, and the lack of raw material in many industries. We still seeing those impacts, especially now here in Brazil, at the sense. And we bring here, and when we bring the discussion of sustainability to supply chain, this vision brought in a systemic way, in a way or another. And in this sense, I would like to open the discussion to our panelists with one initial question. So we do the same question and do a round of discussion with you guys. So what are the biggest challenges in dealing with supply chain in the context of sustainability? I will start with, let's see my screen, Suzanne.
Thank you very much, Gustavo. I think in terms of sustainability, and my interest in particular, is one of the major issues that is the vulnerability to human rights risks in the supply chain. And this comes about because sourcing globally in places without strong human rights regulation, also because sourcing is done from multiple locations with multiple tiers and lack of visibility. We also find there's extensive outsourcing, which has really made businesses dependent on suppliers. There's pressures for cost reduction, forcing suppliers to take shortcuts, and just in time causes issues regarding vulnerability. So one of these biggest issues that I think is in terms of modern slavery, which is really affecting over 40 million people around the world. These individuals are working in harsh labour conditions. They're deprived of freedom in risky situations with large effects, both physically and mentally. And this is a large social problem in the supply chain, which is reflected in a number of the UN Sustainable Development Goals and affecting the most vulnerable in our society, mainly women and children. Also, it affects those who are suffering from racial and national inequalities and in particular industries, for example, like clothing, which is a lot of research has been done in the clothing industry. And over the last 10 years, there's been lots of legislation worldwide to try and deal with these issues, such as the US California Transparency Act of 2010, the UK Modern Slavery Act of 2015, and in Australia in 2018, the Australian Modern Slavery Act. And in the Australian Modern Slavery Act, it describes situations where offenders use coercion, threats, or deception to exploit victims and undermine their freedoms. This can include human trafficking, slavery, servitude, forced labour, debt bondage, forced marriage, and the worst forms of child labour. And certainly forced marriage is one thing that's been here in Australia, a lot of work and news about that. And it is really regarding serious exploitation. Under the Australian Modern Slavery Act, entities are required to comply with reporting requirements and issue modern slavery statements. And it's a requirement for large businesses and government enterprises that have turnover of over 100 million Australian dollars. It's aimed to ensure that the supply chain is more transparent, and companies have to report on their global operations and their global supply chain. And these statements are published in an online register. But we know that modern slavery is difficult to detect because its roots are often buried in the supply chain of large corporations. And certainly large corporations are having to deal with this, but certainly it is difficult for them to track a number of different tiers in their supply chain. So ideally, the legislation is about reporting, but what's more important is how they regulate themselves and how they develop proper structures to pinpoint where these issues are occurring in their practices and in their supply chain, and how they institutionalize ethical behavior in how they go about monitoring their supply chain. I think these issues transcend what we call CSR and really look at how these are incorporated and embedded in all of their organisational practices. I'll just leave it there, but this is the biggest issue that we're facing in supply chain at the moment.
Really interesting perspective. So when we bring this discussion, for example, to modern slave or human traffic, it's something that we have for a while and all around the world in this sense. And I think that transparency in the supply chain could be a way to deal with that. So and nowadays, as society is doing more pressure to know where it's from, what I'm consuming, could be my clothes, could be my electronic advice. So in this sense, maybe it's some pushing to bring more transparency to the discussion, to see more what's going on and happening in different perspectives. So thank you, Suzanne, for bringing this to the discussion. And Nico, for you, what's the biggest challenge?
Yeah, I mean, Suzanne was extremely comprehensive, so I'll try not to repeat too much, even though it's very easy to buy into everything that she said. I think I mean my starting point or my perspective starting point is that, of course, the global supply chain is really what is characteristic of how modern capitalism is organized. I mean, if we look in a historical perspective, what has changed perhaps over time, this is perhaps one of the more striking differences, how production is being organized and set up in a global and extremely fragmented way. So the very notion of the global supply chain, even though the image is of a chain, the more, how would you say, proper image would perhaps be about fragmentation, not the whole chain, but a fragmented chain, especially if we start to think about questions of responsibility. So the supply chain is also an image of the fragmentation of responsibility on the one hand, but also a distancing of moral responsibility in a sense. So it becomes extremely unclear, even with notions of transparency, that both who is responsible, but also the question of who is accountable and through what means in a sense. The global supply chain, my interest, of course, it lies both with the greening of the supply chain, but more so perhaps with questions about social issues such as labor issues, human rights, as you correctly pointed out in your presentation of my background in a sense. And the supply chain is also a way to organize or disorganize labor. So labor power, in a sense, is challenged by the fragmentation of the supply chain and this constant threat of moving production elsewhere. Now, what has been exposed perhaps with the COVID situation is another sustainability issue. I think for me, we can, of course, elaborate more on that later, but it's illustrative also of the question that you just asked. Of course, it shows how extremely dependent we are on supply chains. I mean, to the extent that it cannot be considered sustainable, responsible, or healthy in the long run, because it increases the risks mostly for the most vulnerable populations. I mean, it might feel terrible, as I have some friends here in Finland or in the United States who say, this will have a terrible effects on Christmas or buying Christmas presents or Black Friday or something like that. So of course the effects of this how would you say, the centering or decentering of the supply chains takes very different forms in different places. But of course it also exposes kind of openings perhaps of renegotiating these kind of power dynamics that I just talked about, because the supply chain are also extremely anchored in certain places, certain we can call them choke points. So of course the Suez Canal being case of point, one ship was able to stop the whole system of global supply chains, or not the whole, but a lot. So that in a sense shows how extremely vulnerable the global supply chain is also, which in a sense also gives up openings of renegotiating power to a certain extent, for example, for labor. But yes, my point is twofold. So yes, it's about splintering of the responsibility, but the splintering of the responsibility will not be solved by the question of transparency. That is more solved through the question perhaps of accountability, and accountability is then tied to the question, how are we able to, on an international scale, regulate the supply chain? And of course, the international regulation of the supply chain has proven a very elusive concept. Perhaps we are nearing there. We see the Modern Slavery Act in the UK, the Vigilance Act in France, and on EU level, various different sort of aspects that give these kind of openings for, again, opening the discussion and debate on a serious manner about the possibility of internationally regulating the supply chain when it comes to sustainability issues. So that is my short opening rather than a short answer.
Great, thank you, Nico. I really like your historical perception, bringing the point of modern capitalism, for example, and the power relations that we have. I think one of the things, making like summarizing some points that you brought to the discussion, we passed it through the one age of consuming, production, consuming. And in the beginning, companies doesn't care what they have to do to deliver products and etc. to fill the need of society in consumptions. And nowadays this is changing. And as you pointed, related to accountability. So again, this is a way to do it. When we recall the history of sustainability or environmental practice, for example, we start with accountability, regulations, etc., and then you start the pressure, and then you start to change the company's reality together with the pressure of the society. And also the capitalism model, the modern capitalist model, we see, and this highlight the difference that we have all over the world. So as you said, when we're talking about Black Friday and Christmas shopping, the other side, we're talking about food, for example, food security, have food for some realities. And as the challenge that we have in sustainability, they are systemic and hard to deal with. A supply chain, a global supply chain, also systemic. So we need to see all the points of interaction. So, well, let's bring more for this in the discussion following. Professor Suzanne, what do you think? What's the biggest challenge?
Wow. Thank you again, Gustavo, for inviting me to be here. It's great to be with Suzanne and Nico and met everyone else here. We have a small group, but it's great to listen to all of you. I was thinking about what Suzanne and Nico just said, and I was thinking of the concept of sustainability itself. And considering the main aspect that both of them brought were the aspects, the social aspects. And I was really happy to listen to both of you, because when we start investigating or doing research on sustainability in supply chain, at least when I started in my area, we had lack of publications and attention toward the social aspects of sustainability. And nowadays, we are aware of the importance of modern slavery issues and other social issues in supply chain. And we have a lot of papers already published about it. And now, even better, companies are starting to get aware of it as well. So it's great to hear both of you discussing that. It's really an important issue for a country like Brazil. Last week, like Gustavo was mentioning, the idea of we are discussing about food. Yeah, food safety and security. Why? Like we saw on the news here in Brazil last week, some people going over a garbage truck trying to get food, fighting for food. So what the pandemic did to some parts of our country, increased both inequality and the conditions, the work conditions. So if it was a bad thing before, those social aspects here related to sustainability in Brazil, now it's even a bigger challenge, because we have lost a lot of our power in terms of money, buying power. And when this happens, the whole economy suffers with that, especially the poorest, okay? The bottom line of our pyramid. So yes, I agree with both of you that one of the main challenges we are dealing with sustainability right now are related to social aspects. Therefore, otherwise, we cannot disconsider the environmental aspect of it. Especially for a country like Brazil, we are such a huge country, and we are in the middle of these global discussions related to the Amazon and the exploration of our forest. And besides that, we have a powerful internal market. Even though I'm discussing about inequality, we still have a middle class and an upper class that consumes a lot. And all of these consumptions are bringing some pressures concerning sustainability issues, especially related to the post-consumption. Okay? I've been doing some research related to post-consumption and all the difficulty of dealing with the waste. How can we deal with waste, not only along the supply chain, talking about waste of production, because companies and legislations are already trying to take care of it. But we have a huge problem, especially here in Brazil and in the city where I live. I live in São Paulo, which is the biggest city in Brazil and in all Latin America. We have strong pressures towards waste collection, waste processing, waste reduction, everything related to waste. And sorry about my dog, it's trying to participate. And one thing related to waste, post-consumption waste here in Brazil, is that there are some, I think, some initiatives that some companies, some supply chains are already taking to involve those underprivileged people and bring them into the supply chain. So that is one of the most part of my research. I do some research related to the inclusion of those, we call them catadores, waste pick collectors. Okay? In Brazil, we say catadores. We are trying to include those underprivileged waste pick collectors into the supply chain. But real inclusion, not only use them to collect some garbage around and pay a little money or almost nothing, and working in poorest conditions, but we are trying to develop a way of formally including those waste pickers into the supply chain. So I think that for a country as Brazil, if you try to focus on these two challenges, waste, post-waste consumption, or how to do with that, post-consumption waste, and ways of including those waste picker collectors into the supply chain is going to be a great challenge, especially post-COVID. Yeah, in Brazil, what we are facing right now, the boom of the e-commerce. Everyone is locked at home. We cannot go out, we cannot go shopping. If you go shopping, we have restrictions. So what people decide to do, they start to consume online. And they are asking for delivery of everything, food, clothes, everything. I suffered a surgery this weekend, so I cannot cook. I'm asking for delivery of food. And it's terrible when we look at those packers, so many packers, so many waste. So this is happening right now in Brazil. So for thinking of Brazil and in Latin America, I can say that the biggest challenge is dealing really with the trade-offs that are involved with the real definition of sustainability. We talk about economic issues, we talk about environmental issues, and we talk about social issues. We have three problems, those three issues happening at the same time right now in our country. We do not have a good economy, like some economies are doing much better than us at this moment. We have huge inequality, and also we have legislation. We cannot say that we do not have legislation. We do not need more legislation. We need some application of the law, really, and enforcement of the law. So some issues related to sustainability to Brazil, they have to be tackled in the three pieces or dimensions of sustainability: economic, environmental, and social at the same time. And that is really an issue, because talking about sustainability only through the environmental aspect or dimension of it is something, and we have faced great advancements all over the world with cleaner production, green production, but when it comes together, economic aspect, social aspect, and environmental aspect, all the same time, this is the real challenge. The real challenge is do sustainability as we should do, as looking at the three dimensions of it. At least that is my feeling. I'm sorry, I may be too sensitive today, maybe because of the surgery or because the situation we are suffering right now in our country. but I'm really touched by this. This is the real challenge. We have to make sustainability happen in our country and in the world in the 3 dimensions. There is no other way out. I think that's the only way. Okay. Thank you, Gustavo.
Thank you. Thank you. It's really interesting to see the perspective of Brazilian reality as an emerging market. Despite Brazil is really particular, especially comparing with all over Latin America, but we face lots of challenges on that. And when you talk about delivering, etc., this is something, despite it's not something really new when we look to United States or Europe, for example. In Brazil, we are seeing this happening right now with COVID situation. So it's a new set of problems because we have the ways, of course, and we have the way to deal with the workers, the delivery guys. We're going to the homes and packets, etc. So it's a new way to connect and interact. But something interesting of the 3 points is that we discussed transparency, we discussed accountability, and we discussed enforcement of the guidance. So it's interesting to see as a timeline. Now we start with transparency, go to accountability, and we try to enforce that. As you said, Susana, in Brazil, we have lots of legislation happening, environmental legislation, economics, etc. There's a lot. This is beautiful, I would say. You have lots of measurement on that, but we don't have this enforcement. And of course, we have corruption. We have we have this vein of help people. So you look, but you don't look. You see, but you don't see. So it's a sense that we have to overcome to face the challenge of sustainability. So really interesting perspective. Well, let me move to the second round of the discussion. And supply chain, and that the context of supply chain is growing year by year when we look to the field of study. And we know that as initial background, we have logistics area, and then now we see lots of connections with different fields. As the importance grow, we are understanding more supply chain and interacting and the dialogue with different fields of studies. Based on what we just discussed related to sustainability issues and what we're seeing now, is there room to innovate in the way we deal with supply chain? So now I'm going to Suzanne.
Thanks very much, Gustavo. And really picking up what Susanna was saying there, I think that was really interesting. And the way you've summed it up, Gustavo, as well, about the 3 different aspects, because when I was thinking about innovation, this is exactly what I was thinking about. So the notion of trust, just because organizations report, doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing good things necessarily. And so, companies may declare that they treat their workers fairly, for example, and we report on that via disclosure mechanisms. But in practice, it could be quite problematic. And so in line with this idea around worker-driven social responsibility, some firms in Australia, and I'm sure worldwide, are experimenting with apps that, for example, can support worker voice initiatives and make the actual activities that they're engaged with more transparent and allow more people to actually see what's actually happening. So other technologies that organisations are using are also around blockchain, which is a form of cryptocurrency used in organisational contexts. And blockchain is being labelled as a democratic form of technology that can preclude malicious actors in the supply chain from being anonymous and affecting the destiny of many unprotected workers. So blockchain, for example, at its core can help ensure products are ethically sourced, manufactured and distributed from point of origin to destination. And this can assist by making data verifiable and sharing it across this network through the creation of databases to which users who may not know each other can input and verify data. Now, this capacity is only more recently being recognised but is being seen as a form of social innovation to really provide visibility across lower tier suppliers, to actually, for focal firms to actually see what's happening in their supply chain. But, you know, the use of these sort of technological solutions is still quite problematic, because blockchain, for example, has been linked to generating other forms of oligarchy in organisations, where individuals who concentrate their technological resources can still rule and have power over others. And such technological solutions also have the potential of being used for surveillance and control of workers, rather than helping them in what sociologists would call surveillance capitalism, which really picks up some of the things that Nico was talking about as well. And so, yeah, there are some ideas that may help, but I don't think they're going to necessarily be as successful as some people in the technology field are really arguing at the moment. I'll leave it there and ask Nico and Susanna to pick those points up. Thank you.
Perfect. Let's keep rolling. So I will pass to Nico. The same question: if you have room for innovate in the day we deal with supply chain, and how to do it.
Right. So yeah, interesting question, and of course, it's always, in a sense, there is some value always to deconstruct the question to its core, that what is it that we mean with innovation. To a certain extent, it's good if we simplify, in a sense, also for ourselves, that what is it that we mean with innovation. That, for example, when Susana rightly said that, you know, the problem might not be as such about you know, not laws not existing, it's about enforcing them. So would actual enforcement of laws, if that would actually happen, would that be an innovation, since it happens so seldomly? Well, to a certain extent, that would be an innovation in itself, or at least it would produce innovative value, because it seems to be such a challenge. But of course, in general, when we hear the notion of innovation, it brings us to more of a technocentric perspective. And of course, technology plays a role in the supply chain. Suzanne rightly brought forward these blockchains and other sort of forms of technology that can somehow enhance the transparency of the chains themselves. But of course, the root problems still exist, and very seldomly do technologies try to grapple with the root problems that are actually causing the problems themselves. And that is perhaps where we need to rethink. But do we need innovations to rethink? That remains to be seen. Blockchain, case of point, we see all kinds of strange things come out from sort of a capitalist grounding of blockchains, non-fungible tokens, who have become a way of extreme speculation, taking images of images and selling them to absolutely ridiculous prices. Is this how we should use blockchain? Well, this is how we use blockchain, because that's a way to extract extreme profits from it through speculation. So in a sense, I think that the more fundamental question is not about innovation itself, but how, what kind of problems are we trying to solve with the innovations themselves? And not always is it about technological innovations. It's about perhaps reframing certain things that we take for granted and question them in a very fundamental way. Now, I'll take one example that I like to at least speculate about, and that's the notion of circular economy, which is, in a sense, something that is fundamental to how we think about sustainability in the supply chain. And we can take the question of global warming in here. So in a sense, the supply chain tries to create or in the circular economy thinking, it is about creating a closed loop where all waste is actually being used, and you can create either profit or you can create value from it. But if we think about the problem of global warming, it is not actually about circulation as such. The problem currently with global warming is that we're producing so much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that it's not anymore about, you know, trying actually to get it down to the level of 1996. Actually, the pressure is that we have a negative carbon footprint, in a sense that it probably will not be sufficient, that we are just stagnating the output of carbon dioxide. We also need to have a negative mark. Now, if we have a negative mark of carbon dioxide, that we actually take out more from the atmosphere than we are producing, then this causes a big challenge for capitalism itself. And we can see that in existing technologies. So there exists a Swiss company called Climeworks, and they have invented a machine, so a very clear technology that can suck carbon dioxide out of the air. And by heating the carbon dioxide, they can transform it into mineral form. So it takes a form that looks like something that you can touch. And this you can actually then put in the ground, you know, in some mine or something like that. Thus, you are taking out carbon dioxide from the air and storing it, and it is, you know, not in circulation anymore. Now, what does Climeworks actually do? They do three things with the carbon dioxide. They store it, but that there is no profit in storing it because there is no market for buying that kind of negative use value. What there is a market for is that if we are a company such as Microsoft that uses the services of Climeworks, they are compensating their own production with it. So they buy carbon credits, or Climeworks sells carbon credits, and thus there is a use value and an exchange value also for the carbon. It's being sold. But at the same time, Microsoft is producing carbon dioxide, and it's going to be a zero-sum game. It's not going to be a negative sum. It can also be used to be sold as carbon dioxide that is being used in soft drinks, and thus again, you know, it is about producing more stuff. You use the carbon dioxide to produce more stuff. But the current capitalist system cannot actually handle a negative use value of carbon dioxide. And that's I mean, from even if someone would create a magic wand that you could, you know, just by using it once, everything is gone. Now, that is also a problem for capitalism, because that would be a one use of the technology. You would not be able to reproduce and produce more profit from it. So it would probably be deemed an unworthy technology, at least from the perspective of the market. So yeah, if we go by the market economy, I would posit that it's almost impossible to solve the question of global warming, because there will not be market incentives to just take out carbon dioxide from circulation. The incentive is actually to keep it circulating and creating new capital, accumulating more capital on capital, and so forth. So yeah, long story, but yeah, it goes to my general story about going to the fundamentals. What is causing the problems is probably more important than the particular technologies themselves. Thanks.
Interesting. It's a good perception. I really like it. I noted here, what are the problems that we are trying to solve, really, in essence. In the sense, it's a good reflection every time we talk about sustainability and new business strategies related to sustainability issues. Here in Brazil, we are seeing the boom of ESG discussions, for example. So why we are doing that? What is the point of that? So this goes in connection with how can we solve the challenges on supply chain, for example, and use innovation for that. So thank you, Nico. And Susana, for you, Is there room to innovate? And how to
Yes,
do it?
plenty of room for innovation in the way we approach supply chain. This last phrase that Nico said, going to the fundamentals, that's the real answer, I believe. We have the challenge to innovate first in the way we think, we live, and we produce. We have to discuss about a business model. We cannot live or continue living and producing and growing this global supply chain. We have just discussed that what we are facing and living in the challenge related to sustainability and to social aspects, environmental aspects, either economic aspects, they are all related to the intrinsic characteristics of supply chain. And the characteristics of supply chain are related to the way we think of production and economics. Yeah, this linear production way of living that we take, make, or produce and dispose has to be thought. We have to rethink it. We have to find another way out. Yeah? Was nice that Nico approached circular economy. Circular economy has been discussed, especially by companies right now, here in Brazil at least. I've seen several movements also in Europe, even in China, discussing circular economy as a way to innovate, because it's a way to innovate related to these problems that we are living. And they say that everything have to start in the design. If you rethink the way you design everything, you are going to produce stuff that can be reused, remanufactured, okay, reintroduced into the system. You can avoid waste, and you can keep this rolling inside the system. But only think what is discussing right now related to innovation, most innovation are towards the technological aspects, like both Suzanne and Nico mentioned. And if you look at this idea of circular economy, they talk about two cycles. One that is the technological cycle, and other one that's the biological cycle. When we approach innovation in supply chains, we have to approach innovation both from the biological and technological cycle. So we think of refurbishing, remanufacturing. This is the technological side of it, the technological cycle. But we have also to think in a ways of biological cycle of producing also and investing in innovation related to these biological aspects. Like Nico was talking about CO2 emissions. But if you don't work together and innovate together on both cycles at the same time, both technological and biological, we are going to find an imbalance in this way we are innovating in supply chain. Right now, if you look at the main publications related to supply chain, the main supply chain management journal, most publications are talking a lot about innovation in supply chain. But what kind of innovation? They are talking about RFID, blockchain, IoT, cloud computing, everything that according to companies help you to deliver fast, help you to increase transparency, data transparency, and using this transparency to deliver better and to relate better with your supplier and your whole supply chain. They are discussing about digital twin. Digital twin is wonderful. You can simulate your whole operation in a computer as you use sensors, drones, and you monitor, you collect data, real-time data. You can simulate your whole operation, your whole supply chain in a computer. And then when you start to operate, going online, you can control and make all the necessary adjustment. That is great. And there are a lot of investment for that. We are discussing a lot about digital transformation, but we are still, like my grandpa used to say, you are paving the way that the cow makes, okay? The cow walk just like doing a way that is not a straight way. It does ways like this. So when we are putting technology at the top of a way of thinking, like the linear way of production that we have right now, we are just making some incremental innovation. Although we can call it disruptive innovation because we are bringing a lot of technology. See, I'm talking about digital twins. I'm talking about simulate a whole supply chain operation and follow with real online, real-time information. That is really disruptive, but it's disruptive over a system that has to be rethought. We have to think first and innovate first in the way we do business. So I discuss a lot about a new business model. If you think about new business model, we are also going to think and change the way we do supply chain management, we do business, okay? But yes, we can innovate. There is a lot, there is plenty of possibilities for that, okay? And I think companies are going in a good way related to technology, but they still have to go another way. Like Suzanne mentioned, social innovation. Sometimes talking about social innovation, we are talking about innovation related to processes, some small processes. If you can innovate and help some people that didn't have access to high tech or to money to pay for these high tech innovations, they could innovate in the way they do their business, that sometimes do not use any technology in the way of computers or IoT or blockchain, but they have some processes and they have innovate in this process. So there are plenty of things to do and plenty of challenge. The research on supply chain innovation is at the beginning. Okay, we have few research about that, at least in my area, in the papers, the journals that I follow, and there is plenty of room to both innovate incremental and disruptive. Okay, and we are discussing that when we talk about ambidextrous in supply chain. We are discussing about innovating supply chain, both with incremental innovations that for countries like Brazil tend to be very useful, especially for small businesses, okay, and they do not have access to credit. So how can they invest in these high-tech solutions? How can they invest in a blockchain or in an IoT, cloud computing? That's really a long way for them, but they can innovate incrementally. At the same time, we have all these movements related to startups. Here in Brazil, we have plenty of new ecosystems that are developing based on startup solutions and innovations brought by startups. So another opportunity that we can see for supply chain is trying to integrate those fast, flexible, and innovative small companies that are startups into their supply chain. A supply chain that is already too big, too complex, with less flexibility, but they have to find ways of bringing and integrate those startups in a way of innovation or promoting innovation in the supply chain. So to sum up, I believe that yes, there are plenty of room to innovate, both incrementally and disruptive, and we cannot rely only on technological innovation. We have to focus also on process innovation. And most of all, like Nico said, we have to go to the fundamentals. Yeah, we have to rethink the way we do business. Okay, so even think of new businesses business models. Okay.
Great, this is great. I captured 2 points, interesting point that I would like to reinforce. The first one is the last phrase that you just said, that we need to discuss the business model. Like we need to redefine, rethink the way we do business, the way we produce things, the way we consume things. So it's a shared responsibility, of course, from the companies and also in the society, the customers, et cetera, et cetera. And in the other hand, we have to look to the fundamentals of this. So I think this discussion of business model pass through this discussion of fundamentals, why we are doing those things and how to do it. And also, I see a lot of room for technology, and I really like the point of blockchain because it's something new that we have to discover how to use in a proper way. Nico mentioned that we are now in a speculation in the sense some cases we are using blockchain to bitcoins, for example, etc. But I see that lots of opportunities to help different sectors. When we look at supply chain, for example, when we look to the law sector, for example, when we look to sharing information process, etc. So we are in this movement. I see this movement happening. I see that the systemic view, the society's developing the systemic view, and also the business leaders, the companies, the researchers, the faculty members, and also the students, so we can move forward those challenges. So coming to a final round, so we can end. After all we discussed it, and of course we have to keep in mind this background of COVID situation, pandemic situation, and how this really impacts all supply chain discussions. And thinking about the future, the post-pandemic world, as we call it, what is the future? What do you see as the future in supply chain management, for example? So we do the round, start with Susana, and then go Suzanne and Nico.
Thanks very much. I really like what you were saying there, Susanna, and some of the things I wanted to discuss in this part is actually picking up what you were talking about there. So, you know, in the post-pandemic world, I see a new set of values and beliefs that need to be realised in the supply chain. And I think what we need to be thinking about are the well-being of employees and customers, and all aspects of the supply chain need to be transformed. So there, when you talk about new business models and new ways of thinking. So adopting a service logic, for example, so that those in the supply chain see the supply chain is not just a transfer of goods, but a service that co-creates value with its customers, whether retail or B2B. And the adopting of these different logics really expands the perceptions of the role of business as they move from an economic and transactional approach to one that incorporates both social and environmental sustainability and transformational service to bring about individual and collective well-being. So we need to move from a focus in the past on global lean supply chains to be more holistic, thinking about an ecosystem perspective. For example, with the whole COVID situation, we've seen companies in Australia really being limited in their global operations because of border closures. And we've had more border closures, and we're an island and really affected by these border closures in probably a lot of other countries. And so we've really had to move to an onshore manufacturing capability that in the past has been really decimated. And we've seen, for example, companies pivot, for example, from small scale craft gin distilleries into hand sanitizer production. And the COVID situation has really brought to the fore how our lack of manufacturing and a reliance on global supply chains has really decimated and caused lots of problems here in Australia with COVID. The other thing I see is this move for customer safety, and a post-COVID world, contactless delivery. Susanna, you picked this up before as well. And really that's an attribute in our supply chains that we need to think about, not just timeliness or accuracy. Keeping employees at safe distances, the flow of customers in stores, the flow of employees at work are really important considerations as we move forward. The other thing is the role of governments. So the pandemic responses, the government regulation regarding health. Our supply chains really need to be able to respond to this increasing regulatory environment and change quickly as they respond to employee wellbeing and customers. And Susanna, you were talking about waste before. Well, here in Australia, we've seen also the incorporation of not-for-profits in the supply chain as they've really assisted in obtaining goods. Food for consumers, for example, we've witnessed in Australia the role of volunteer bodies really helping out after our bushfires last summer, and then the lockdown of vulnerable communities. There's Indigenous communities that have been locked down with COVID and having to isolate, refugees living in high density living arrangements, and the role of volunteer organisation and not-for-profits coming in and helping build up the supply chain. So understanding the role of volunteers in this post-COVID world is really an important consideration, as is the role of technology. So I think a post-COVID world really upends a lot of our thinking that we've come to at this stage. And I'm quite excited about these changes that will occur in our supply chain because of this role of looking at community rather than globalization and what that will mean for our own communities. Thank you.
Perfect. Community, good word to explain that. Thank you, Suzanne. And now, Susana, for you.
Great, Suzanne. I love that community. I think that is one of the way to go over this pandemic period. What to expect for supply chain after the pandemic. A lot of learning. I think we need to learn fast and keep learning because the pandemic is not over, unfortunately. It's still going on, and we are about to have and to suffer more with disruptions. So we have to learn, to innovate, to implement all the necessary changes that we have to thinking of all the supply chains all over the world, not only global supply chain, but also local supply chain. We have to invest a lot, thinking of supply chain a lot in risk mitigation strategy. So not only to become more resilient supply chains, but also to learn to mitigate risk. And to mitigate risk, we can first, we have to identify and monitor this risk very closely. Like Suzanne was talking about the response and new regulations from government. This is also, companies have to monitor that all the time. Depending on the new waves or new strains of the virus, we can face lockdown again. And if you do face lockdown again, so all the regulations are going to change. If they change, it's going to affect the companies and the supply chains. And something very important that Suzanne addressed was the well-being of those laborers. Okay? If a supply chain was always concerned and historically concerned to cost reduction and delivery, fast delivery, now they have to also consider sustainability, as we mentioned, and including in sustainability, the social aspect of people that are involved in those supply chain. Another thing that I feel that we have to consider in this post-pandemic world is the way of, we depend on our ecosystem. This environmental degradation is not going to end easily. In some parts of the world, is even worse than it was before. So we have to pay attention on that. And a lot of partnership and collaboration. If I could say something to anyone who deal with supply chain, either locally or globally, I would say, okay, learn and collaborate. multi-stakeholder initiatives are going to be that's very important for even partnerships, sectorial partnerships, intersectorial partnership. We need to survive all those pandemics, and if it happens again, but also we have to go forward. So at the same time, we have to fight pandemic, but we have to go forward. We have to try to recover our economy. We have to try to keep people safe. So if you don't collaborate, and if you like the example that Suzanne said about being even volunteers to supply chain, we are not going to succeed. So I think that multi-stakeholder initiatives are going to be extremely important for supply chain management in this post-pandemic.
Great, thank you, Susana. And Nico, for you, what do you see as future?
Yeah, I see many things. I mean, first of all, as picking up on one thing that was already mentioned by, I think, both Susana and Suzanne, which is that the reality is that we won't be living on a global scale in a post-pandemic world for a very long time. I think the risk is that we are going to learn the wrong kinds of lessons from the pandemic itself, because now you can already see that the media is shifting its interest, and by that also, at least in the global north, the questions are changing. So now the questions becomes, how can we build resilient enough supply chain so that we can get our Christmas presents? Not, paying very much attention to the fact that, in the global south, in Africa, not even 1% of the population itself is vaccinated against COVID, which is likely to linger on for a very, very long time before we are even possible to talk about on a global scale about the post-pandemic. Now, if we are to talk about something like the post-pandemic in the relation of supply chain, then we need again to go back to very fundamental question about how are the chains constructed and for what reason. I would say that the chains are actually built in a way to maintain an unequal power relation between the global north and the so-called global south. You could see it, for example, in many ways during the pandemic. First, there was much talk about, we will release the patents for the vaccines once we have created them. Now no one talks about that. That is out of the question. The patents will not be released so that the global south will be able to build their own factories and produce offshoots of those patents in the global south themselves. So they will still be dependent on the benevolence of the global north of supplying that, and that these supply chain actually work in that direction. Usually they are built in the other direction, that the consumption happens in the global north, and then the more labor happens in the global south. So I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical about what resilience will mean. I think building resilience will increasingly be about maintaining the unequal relations and seeing to it that if some disruption happens, there is as little effect as possible in the global north, and not actually paying much attention to what happens in the global south, unfortunately. I think the signs are in the air. The solidarity of humanity seemed to have lasted for approximately three months, and then we were back more or less thinking in the same way of maintaining inequality through what we call resilience of this supply chain. So again, I would say that if we want to learn something about the pandemic, we need to break the monopolies of these unequal exchanges and rethink in a very fundamental way how we see humanity as an entity, not a global north that is resilient and a global south that is deemed to be forever after vulnerable and serving the needs of the global south. And this, it's an easy question, but we know that that's that's a humongous task. And I'm afraid that we will need something much worse in terms of a crisis for humanity than the pandemic before we realize what the lesson actually was.
Thank you, Nico. Thank you. Yeah, we need systematic change in a sense. So we need to change the way we see the world and the way that we interact. And then maybe the 3 points that I noted here: the community view, the multi-stakeholder view, and see humanity as entity could help us to overcome and try to redefine. And then if you bring the different points that we already mentioned, like redefine business model, rethink process, rethink relations, rethink the way that we look to globalization, for example. It could be something that could help to see a different perspective on supply chain management in a different world that we're going to face after pandemic situation. So thank you so much for the session, for all the comments and all the reflection. It was a really great and inspiring discussion, I would say. We see that is a lot of room for changing, and we see changing happen. So it's interesting to understand this moment that we're facing right now, because the things are changing. So the future, it will be different, and we need to work to that. So this is also a responsibility for business schools, that we are here to educate the new leaders, or the leaders that are going to work with those supply chains, or work with the companies, work as suppliers, etc., to redefine this mindset for humanity, understand the humanity as a whole, as Nico said. So thank you very much, Nico, Suzanne, and Susana, for this panel. It was really interesting. And yeah, so it was nice to have you here. And everyone, so those who are arriving now, we have our final session of today. So I'm going to invite Jonas Hartel. Jonas is now Chief of the Executive Director Office of UNITAR, and he will talk about SDGs and that decade of action. So let's see what Jonas brings to us.
Thank you, ISAE FGV, in particular Norman de Paula Arruda and Gustavo Loiola, and the conference organizing team for inviting me today as your keynote speaker. I have followed the work of ISAE FGV since my first trip to Brazil in 2008. Ever since, the team around Norman has championed strong ties and partnership with the UN through the Prime Network. One action stands out. During the 2012 Rio+20 Summit, ISAE FGV and the Prime Network in Brazil helped organize a number of events which highlighted the work of business schools supporting sustainable development. It was at that Rio+20 meeting that the world's governments decided to create these Sustainable Development Goals as a follow-up to the MDGs. The SDGs, or Global Goals, were then launched 3 years later in 2015. I've been asked by the organizers to reflect on where we stand in achieving the SDGs today and, of course, looking forward. Obviously, we are living through some of the most extraordinary months of human history. The COVID-19 pandemic has taken anywhere between 3. It has bettered the global economy and completely changed our lives. Agenda 2030 and the SDGs, adopted 6 years ago, seems like a distant dream. What were the SDGs, the global goals? These were a set of 17 goals and 169 targets, which captured a utopian vision of a world without poverty, without hunger, with greater equality, especially gender equality, with access to all for modern sustainable energy, of water and sanitation, with sustainable growth, sustainable cities, and a world where we could take care of our oceans, land, control climate change, and did all of this with finance technology, and cooperation. With the pandemic still ongoing, it is difficult to get a full picture of where we are today in implementing this dream. But what I would like to do today is give you a rough and ready picture, which unfortunately doesn't look very pretty. But I'm also a pragmatic optimist, so please bear with me to the end for some positive news and how you can help to make a difference. Please also remember that the global goals were a set of interrelated goals. They are to be pursued in a collective and integrated fashion. They are applicable to all countries. They prioritize the most vulnerable people and countries, and they emphasize the need to create peaceful and just societies. So where does the world stand regarding the main aspects of the global goals? Poverty. The global extreme poverty rate rose in 2020 for the first time in 2 decades. Estimates are that up to 150 million people have been pushed back into extreme poverty. Ending poverty, one of the clear goals by 2030, looks like an impossible target. COVID-19 has shown the importance of social protection systems to protect health, jobs, and incomes. 4 billion people need such protection. To bring us back on track, given the multidimensional nature of poverty, multiple actions are required, but crucial for all is to give priority to the most distressed people in planning and budgeting decisions. Social protection systems everywhere need also a significant revamp. Second, hunger and sustainable agriculture. Since 2014, hunger has been rising globally. COVID-19 has accelerated this trend, pushing almost 132 million people globally into chronic hunger. All countries are suffering from different forms of malnutrition. 1 out of 4 people in the world suffer from food insecurity, with the highest levels in sub-Saharan Africa. 1 in 4 children under 5 suffer from stunting. More women are suffering from anemia. Agriculture transition is very urgent in our freshwater scarce world. We need better farm systems and a drastic reduction in food loss and waste. Thirdly, health for all ages. The disruptions caused by COVID-19 have halted and renewed all the gains that we have made in several health areas, including maternal and children's health, immunization, and communicable diseases. Now the health sectors everywhere are seriously disrupted. The most extensively affected services include mental health, neurological and substance abuse disorders, TB, HIV, cancer screenings, NCDs, especially hypertension and diabetes, family planning, and malaria. COVID-19 has also shown how unequal our societies and our world has become. It has also revealed how weak health services delivery has become, especially in the poorest countries. The shock we have received is a wake-up call for multiplying our health spending, building our health infrastructure, greater cooperation between nations, strengthening digital health, and look at all that is essential in preventing a recurrence of what we have seen in 2020. Next point, education. The impact of the pandemic on education has been a generational catastrophe. School closings have had a devastating impact. Hundreds of millions are falling behind. 2 out of 3 students worldwide have felt the impact of closures of schools. Those who have no access to virtual learning are hardest hit. Disparities in access to education and learning needs a higher priority, especially in addressing the digital divide. Budgetary allocations to this sector need a drastic ramp up. We have a fight to scores of illiteracy and ignorance. Gender equality. Violence against women and girls has intensified, child marriage is increasing, disproportionate burden of household duties on women is increasing. This is happening as women play an increasing role as frontline health providers, case providers, and leading in the response and recovery effort. The COVID-19 crisis presents an opportunity to reshape and rebuild systems to advance gender equality. Efforts need to be redoubled to protect women from violence, including domestic violence, enhance their leadership roles, improve workplace conditions, improve inheritance rights, improve budgeting for gender equality issues. Societies need massive efforts, especially community efforts, to change the position of women. The next point on the SDG agenda is water and energy. COVID-19 has shown how critical safely managed drinking water is to contain the spread of the disease. Sanitation and hygiene services, hand washing is imperative. Countries face water stress, water pollution, degraded water systems. The world is not on track and can get there only with integrated and holistic approaches to water management. 2 billion people lack access to drinking water. 3.6 billion do not have access to sanitation, and 2.3 billion lack basic hygiene services. Clean and sustainable energy are at the heart of COVID-19 response and climate change, but the world, despite progress, is still short of achieving affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. At the core of this effort is the need for the finance industry to address issues around investments in coal and fossil fuels. COP26 in Glasgow will hopefully give a boost to this SDG. Solar, hydropower are the key renewable energy forms which need a push like never before. Economic growth. COVID-19 has dragged the world into the worst global recession since the Great Depression. 255 million full-time jobs have been lost, 4 times that were lost during the financial crisis. Global tourism has collapsed. Apart from the jobs lost due to the crisis, the impact on women and youth was most severe. Manufacturing and transport have been hit very hard. Supply chains have been widely disrupted. Small-scale industry have been battered. Inequalities. The pandemic is making inequalities of all types worse and hitting the most vulnerable and poorest hardest. The poorest countries are 10 years behind on SDG progress in this area. Refugees were the highest ever in 2020. Thousands of migrants died during their migratory journeys. Cities. The direct and indirect costs of the crisis have been severe and made the goals on sustainable cities even more difficult. Slum dwellers have increased, and the quality and vulnerability of their lives have worsened. Consumption and production patterns. Unsustainable production and consumptions are driving the climate crisis, the pollution crisis, and the biodiversity crisis. Sustainable lifestyles have to underpin future inclusive and equitable development, and we hope that we have learned our lesson and will not slip back into the way we were. Climate change. Total greenhouse gas emissions increased in 2020. 2015 to 2020 were the 6 warmest years on record, putting all the SDGs at risk. COP26 has to show the ambition that we are seeing and spending in the US and the EU in the context of COVID-19. Expenditures have to be driven to create a world where we reach net zero emissions by 2050. Once again, the finance industry must power change, including towards poor countries, to help mitigation and adaptation. Oceans. Our oceans and seas are in deep crisis as a result of pollution, warming, and acidification. These changes are long-term and call for a very urgent scale-up to protect our marine environments and resources through coordinated and effective protection. Terrestrial ecosystems. Land degradation, deforestation, biodiversity loss are having a profound consequence for our well-being and survival. The COVID-19 biodiversity loss nexus is understood, but much better. Much more needs to be done to put the health of our planet at the center of our plans. Peaceful and just societies, and we're coming to the end of that long list here. We are so far from this goal. Millions of people live in fragile and conflict-affected areas. 80 million people have been forcibly displaced. COVID-19 has exposed inequalities, discrimination, and weakened our rights and protection systems. A new Cold War has unfolded. People feel more vulnerable, helpless, and exposed. Violence against children is widespread. Human trafficking is rising. There is no sign of a decrease in bribery and corruption. In the era of COVID-19, the epidemic of fake news, fake drugs, black markets in life-saving drugs and oxygen is up on the rise. The right to information is being challenged by the right to misinformation. Human rights institutions are being hammered. Last point now, means of implementation and partnership that relates to SDG number 17. The pandemic has provided an unprecedented shock to the global system. Lack of financial resources, trade tensions, technological obstacles, lack of data, a dramatic 40% drop in foreign direct investment, debt distress is squeezing the policy and the fiscal space of developing countries. COVID-19 has shown the importance of multilateralism, global partnerships, the need for a global response to ensure the health and well-being of all, especially in the developing world. But we have fallen short. The need for building back better must rejuvenate this goal. ODA flows must increase. FDI must be reformed and promoted. Investment treaties encouraged. The digital divide fixed. Trade boosted. The quest for better data re-energized. While I do not present a rosy picture, but rather a very worrying one of the state of the SDGs, I'm an optimist that COVID-19 has served as a wake-up call that will serve as a prompter of serious action for our people and our planet. We have seen great community resilience, the record time production of life-saving vaccines and treatments. We have a solid foundation to build upon. Now our most urgent task is to make vaccines accessible to all and help poorer countries as promised in the 2030 agenda. Governments, cities, business and industry needs to adopt low-carbon, resilient and inclusive development to conserve natural resources, create new and better jobs, tackle gender equality and also other inequalities. We need to step up efforts for better data to guide policy, especially around the SDG targets, and we need to put technology in the service of the SDGs and the poor. Finally, I want to highlight that the UN Secretary General Guterres recently launched a seminal report titled Our Common Agenda in New York in late September, and several actions are designed to accelerate SDG achievement. Many of the key proposals across the 12 commitments that are contained in this report are linked to the objectives of your meeting today around the theme of innovation shaping a sustainable future. They include commitments to improve digital cooperation, re-establishment of the Secretary General's Scientific Advisory Board, strategic foresight and global risk report every 5 years, access to health technologies in low and middle income countries. In connection with the implementation of our common agenda, 3 summits are envisioned over the next years: a Transforming Education Summit, a Summit of the Future, and a World Social Summit. I hope each one of you in your spheres of influence will personalize the SDGs. We need a movement embracing all for realizing the Sustainable Development Goals and the world we want by 2030. Thank you very much. Best of luck with your meeting.
So thank you everyone for being with us today. It was really great to have you all here. All videos of the sessions are going to be shared through our YouTube video channel. So we're going to send it later to all participants enrolled. Tomorrow we start in the same time with amazing discussions on the theme of interculturality as a driver for education. The moderation will be conducted by Matt Morrison, she's head of Prime. And for panelists, we have all CR3 Plus deans. So we have Suzanne O'Keefe from LaTrobe Business School, Karen Spence from Hanken School of Economics in Finland, Christophe Germain from Audencia Business School in France, Norman Arruda from ISAE in Brazil, and Manhu Vergantan from Taipei Management Institute in India, with the next university to join our group. So thank you so much for today. We'll see you all tomorrow. All the details for connections and conference and program, it's all on the conference website, www.cr3conference.com. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.